Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Blake.
Good to see you. Thanks for doing this, for talking with me today. Let me introduce us. I'm Blake Watson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno. And you are Kevin Deluca, professor of communication at the University of Utah. You are also associated with the Asian Studies program there and the Environmental Research Studies program. And today we're talking in anticipation of a symposium that you'll be a part of here at the University of Nevada on February 12th of next year, entitled Capitalism, Climate, and Public Discourse, the Limits and Possibilities of Rhetorical Intervention. And this will happen alongside a public lecture from Naomi Klein the day before, who will be talking about her recently published book about climate change titled This Changes Everything. So we're recording this interview in November by way of advertisement for that event. So I'll just get us started. I want to begin with what I take to be your central contribution to rhetorical studies, which is the image event. In image politics, you define image events as staged protests designed for media dissemination, crafted by outsiders who seek to draw media attention in order to introduce an oppositional line of argument and generate controversy. Your writing focuses a lot on contemporary activism tactics, specifically environmental activism, which you characterize as rejecting traditional formal public argumentation by performing their protests in ways that highlight and display bodies. And essentially, they're compelled to make arguments in this way through visual display, because they can only expect to be discursively framed by those who disagree with them. Their ideas have been excluded from the mainstream conversation, and they're trying to give them a hearing, by hook or by crook, basically. So my first question for you is why do you consider image events a form of argumentation? How exactly do these image performances argue?
A lot of media scholars have talked about, from Innes to McLuhan to people today like Benkler, Yochai Benkler, who's not quite as well known as the first two, but still well known, have noticed, and Walter Ong, etc., that technologies cultivate and foster certain types of thinking. Now, I think it would be a mistake to say that before writing there was no rationality, that there was no reasoning, but they had a different form in an oral culture. That oral cultures think, but they don't think the same way that a print culture thinks. And so if we're going to be in a culture that's no longer a singularly print culture, i.e. we're a culture of multiple media, I would term it a pan-mediated culture. And what I mean by that is we're surrounded by all media all the time because they're just in our smartphones, and it's so easy for us to access any types of media. We can access images, we can access print, we can access movies, we can access music instantaneously. So it's pan-mediated. So we shouldn't expect a very narrow particular form of reason or rationality that's tied to print to predominate in a pan-mediated environment. And so what I want to break down immediately is this dichotomy between thinking or reasoning or rationality and something else, which is always denigrated in that dichotomy, right? Either you're a thinker or you're emotional and out of control and so on. And in doing that, there's also a lot of kind of support from other disciplines where it's very clear that thinking is an emotional act. Right, so Bateson, as far back as the early 70s in Steps to an Ecology of Mind, says that a tear is an intellectual thing. Like, why does he say that? Because he wants to say that thinking is deeply embedded in our bodies and our emotions and our feeling of the world, not something that we can isolate and say thinking is here, feeling is over here. And I think what's happened now with kind of this plethora of social media, that we then have an explosion of different forms of reasoning. And we wouldn't say that they're not reasoning just because they're not adhering to kind of the classic rules of rhetoric or the classic rules of argumentation. And so I would suggest that for rhetoricians and argumentation scholars to remain relevant today, we absolutely must take into account the changing media landscape. And if we don't, then we become antiquated. and archaic, and we're talking about something that we almost never see anywhere. Like, even if we want to point to, say, Congress as the archetype of a public sphere, do we really think what goes on in Congress is rational deliberation with good reasons, and that carries the day? So if we can't even explain Congress through kind of a traditional paradigm of rationality and argumentation, what can we explain in the world? What goes on in the world that adheres to kind of a classical template of argumentation? I'm not sure much of it does.
Right.
And this would be kind of my second point. And I've been talking for so long, who knows what the first point was. But the second point would be is that argumentation scholars, I think, have been too, and public sphere scholars and rhetoricians have been too wedded to process, i.e. argumentation is a certain form of process. You have good reasons supported by solid evidence, on and on and on, right? Instead of saying, no, what rhetoric and argumentation is about is force. It's not about process, right? Instead, it's like, what sort of actions in the world have force? And that, to me, then would be how argumentation works. What is forceful enough to force people and policies to change? There's many examples of this. To harp on kind of Naomi Klein's work on climate change, this changes everything. Well, she didn't say everything is that we finally have the scientific evidence. And in fact, she talks about how we've had the scientific evidence since at least the 1980s, that we knew for sure climate change, I like to call it climate chaos, was happening. So we knew climate chaos was already happening in the 1980s. We had cover stories in Time and Newsweek about this. So it was not a secret. So what changed everything? What changed everything was the force of the images of these droughts, of these 100-year storms happening every year in the United States, of these wildfires all over California that are just burning down the state. And those are affective events that have force, that don't fit into good reasons. They actually disrupt the way we think of the world as it is. And we're like, wow, we cannot keep going as we are in the face of these events that are forcing us to engage the world differently. So what those events do is they force us to feel about the world differently. And then we can make arguments from that opening to say, look, this is what's happening, and you're losing your home. Your house is on fire. This whole town is on fire. Or your house is underwater. New Orleans would be a good example with Hurricane Katrina just about 10 years ago now, I guess. And so these are moments that are affective, that are moments that force us to think about the world differently because of an affective response to an event that disrupted the template we already had for the world. I'll take a break and let you say something.
Yeah, no. So there's a lot there, but okay. So you seem fairly optimistic here, right? As we sort of maybe move over into, I guess, social movement theory or publics theory. I think there's a way of looking at this sort of ontological shift or the sort of media shift and being very skeptical of it, right? Neil Postman, even McLuhan, I think to some extent. It's a Kathleen Hall Jameson, right? These people are a little worried about, I think, what you're talking about, right? Like the loss of
Sure.
Something that you're sort of suggesting maybe never totally existed or is really quite bygone. I'm not sure. But can you talk to me about why you're optimistic, if you're optimistic, if I'm just reading into that, why you think that someone like say Alan Gross, who I know you sort of had a sort of engagement with in argument and advocacy over this exact issue, is wrong to sort of to think of this as a degraded public sphere, or debased for the loss of the way of thinking, this textual way of thinking. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to answer there, and I'll go through it. First of all, I'm in no way optimistic, but I think optimism is besides the point, right? So, like Naomi Klein is optimistic. I think we're past the point of actually addressing climate change in any way that allows reasonable habitation of the planet for people and for lots of other species. We're in the midst, as that book talks about, of the sixth great extinction. We would be remiss to ignore that. So, for example, a prehistoric antelope, the Saigo, S-A-I-G-O, Saigo, I think, just lost 90% of their population in the past year from what the scientists think is probably a climate chaos event, right? And so they have been on the planet since before woolly mammoths, and now they're down to maybe 30,000 left from about 250,000 just a year ago. Right, so those kind of cataclysmic events, we're seeing it with sea life all over the place, where the 10 kind of largest fish species that we eat and stuff will be non-commercial by the year 2050. So the indicators of the planet, topsoil, water, air pollution, climate chaos, all that stuff leads me not to be optimistic. But optimism to me is a different issue besides the question you're bringing up. And I would say that in many ways I'm very sympathetic to Postman, Jameson. I think McLuhan is less about optimism and so on, or pessimism. And I would just say for Jameson and Postman, they're mourning the loss of a prince society. I share that mourning. I love books. I love books as much as they love books. And McLuhan loved books. And I would suggest that for my disagreement with Postman and Jameson is that I don't think the point of being a scholar is to be a moralist, i.e. things are going good, things are going bad. Instead, I think the point is to understand what is happening. So I can lecture everyone and tell everyone, read more books. First of all, my students, even though their grade depends on reading more books, are not bothered to do it. Right? So why would I expect the public in general all of a sudden is just going to read more books because I say it and say, I miss the days of the Lincoln Douglas debates? That's not going to happen. That's a moral stance. That's the preacher stance. Do what's good for you. I'm not interested in moralizing for people, or else maybe I would be a psychologist. Instead, I want to understand what's happening. So if we take McLuhan, McLuhan is very much a person of books. He was not a person of images, of television, of what was happening, the new at the time in the 60s. But he was diagnosing what was happening. He's saying, look, people have different attention spans. People are moved by emotions. People are moved by fragments and so on. And we have to understand what is happening. And I would argue that that is always the task of the scholar, not to lecture people on what we should or shouldn't do in a moralistic vein, but to understand what is happening. So for example, let's take Gladwell. He looks at the social movements today and says, they're not real social movements like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, because Facebook allows for too shallow a social movement. You can click like, you can just share things on different social media platforms with your friends. Fair enough point, but actually, Gladwell, what's going to happen for all social movements, they're not trying to meet a purity standard. They're not trying to be moralists in terms of what counts as a pure social movement. They're going to use whatever means are necessary, whatever tools or weapons are at hand to create social change. So they will use Facebook and they will gather in the streets. It's not an either or. It's not a moral test of what's the right way to do something. It's what works. In other words, what has force in the world. So Occupy Wall Street marched in the streets, and they also set up social media platforms. They even invented social media tools to get their message out. Do both, right? And so as a scholar, my point isn't to lecture social media and say it would be better if you acted like the civil rights movement in the 1960s. My point is to understand what are you doing and how does it have force or not have force in our contemporary media landscape, right? And so that's my big disagreement with them. I love Jameson's work. I love Postman's work. But I just find that at the end, all they can do is end up in despair and maybe get a drink or something, because that's not coming back. Like the age where everyone was reading and they weren't on all these screens and sharing images and stuff, when is that coming back? When do we see that? That's happening after the apocalypse. So things have to get a lot worse and we lose all of our electronics. And then, yeah, maybe people will start reading a lot more books. But until then, they're going to be addicted to their social screens. Do I think that's a good thing? I think it's terrible, personally. I don't have a TV in the house. I don't have a Facebook account. I'm not a person who enjoys being on cell phones all the time. I'm a relic. I'm a dinosaur, right? I want to talk to people. I want to get on a train and start up conversations with strangers. I'm that guy that people burrow into their cell phone even more, right? Because they don't want to be dealing with strangers. I'm used to dealing with strangers. You did. You would be in an environment where you talk to people because you didn't have constant entertainment surrounding you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I just want to dig into that just a little bit further.
Sure.
Because like it does seem to me that the sort of force metaphor that you're using does contradict a kind of modernist metaphor, or so the kind of metaphor that, say, Habermas would use, this idea of doing battle with words as opposed to doing battle sort of with force. And it sounds a little bit like you're sort of rejecting that premise that by describing rhetoric as the thing that has force, the thing that gets results, has effects. In some sense, it seems like battle is battle, maybe. Is that? And I think that's sort of I'm sort of taking something out of your exchange with Alan Gross on this. Is there a difference in the way you and maybe these people we're talking about think about rhetoric as opposed to physical force, even coercion?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is rhetoric violent? And I would say yes. The only way to think of rhetoric as not violence is to, first of all, set up an artificial situation, a public sphere that outlaws all sorts of stuff, social differences, differences in education, differences in gender, differences in race, and so on. And those critiques against the public sphere have been leveled by many, many people, right? And that delimiting of the public sphere is already an act of violence performed through words, through laws, and so on. Who gets to participate, who doesn't get to participate would be almost the originary violence, right? If you're not allowed to participate, no matter how civil people are in that arena, you've already been silenced, and that's an enormous type of violence, right? The other enormous violence in insisting on words as what rhetoric is about and argumentation is about is, first of all, to silence all the people who don't have access to that language and all the beings on the planet that don't have access to that language. It rules out all animals, all plants, et cetera, right? So, and as much scientific research purports today, right, animals think in various ways. They don't think like humans. They're not humans, but they think. They're sentient. They have awareness. They do sorts of stuff. So do their interests just not count because they can't debate in a Habermasian public sphere? Right? I think that's a pretty big problem for that kind of exclusion. But the bigger point I would make is that everyone besides kind of classical rhetoricians, not classical, let's say traditional rhetoricians, I'm not saying rhetoricians who are focused only on Greece, but traditional rhetoricians recognize that words are violent. We could just take the recent example in Missouri. Clearly those students in Missouri, the African Americans, found words to be violent, right? Violent enough for them to be moved to protest, to demand the resignation of a university president, and so on. And the larger community there recognized those words as violent. They weren't alleging that people physically assaulted them, right? They were saying that people used words that were violent towards them. And that was enough, not only for them, that was recognized as violence, not only by African-American students at Missouri, but by the larger community there, right? By the larger college, by faculty members, by the administration in the end. No one said that those words are not violent. So I really have no understanding how we as rhetoricians can go around and say, well, words aren't violent. Violence is over there. Words are over here. It makes no sense. The rest of the world recognizes all the time words have force, words are violent. That's why people talk about hate speech. Now, I'm a pretty big advocate of free speech, and I don't want to limit people's speech because it's violent, because I think all sorts of types of speech are violent, not just hate speech. Basically, as I talk about in our response to Gross, what do words do? Words cut up the world, i.e. words set up the world in a certain way. This is what Foucault talked about at the beginning of The Order of Things, right? When you have an encyclopedia that defines the world in certain ways, animals that belong to the emperor, animals that look like flies from a long distance, animals that are frenzied, animals that have just broken the water pitcher. Okay, that's one way of setting up the world. And then when we have a different way of setting up the world in English, that's another way of setting up the world. Well, that's an act of violence, because one way of viewing the world inevitably obscures or silences another view of looking at the world. For everyone who speaks more than one language, you immediately know that, right? You see the world in French or Chinese, or you see the world in English, and those different ways of seeing the world become different ways of acting in the world and different ways of highlighting some parts of the world and silencing other parts of the world. So I would argue that words are always connected to violence, always connected to force. And I would even use Aristotle as an ally in this instance, because Aristotle said that his book on rhetoric is not simply about words, it's about available means of persuasion. Who knows what those available means of persuasion may be? In some situations, they could be words, other situations, images, other situations, a bomb. Like we would have to say, for example, the bombing of the World Trade Center was clearly an act of violence, right? And it killed a lot of people, and we can condemn it as an act of violence. We can also condemn it as an act of rhetoric, but it was clearly an act of rhetoric. It was meant to send a message. There is no way that those terrorists thought that they were going to overthrow the United States government by bombing the World Trade Center. But they felt for sure that they were sending a message to both the United States and the world, which we received and enacted upon in a whole bunch of ways, rhetorically, militarily, and so on. To give a more current example, though, is we could think about the body of that little boy that washed up on the beaches of Greece in the current migrant crisis. Right. Okay, so how many words did we hear and how many conversations, and this is kind of getting to this idea of the force of images and the power of images and how they are arguments and how they are rhetoric. So we have that image come forward to us, right? And what does that do? That image doesn't just call attention to like the rational arguments about the migration crisis. It itself is this dense fragment that forces people to move and to act, not just in response to that little boy, but all the major leaders, Merkel in Germany, British Prime Minister, Obama in the United States, and so on. They all changed their policy about immigration and migrants and refugees and who's allowed into the country, right? The force of that. To get back to, well, I'll stop for now because I said a lot about two issues there.
No, it's great. I'm actually going to, so I kind of use that to pivot to another question.
Sure.
So you've talked a lot about images. We also talked a lot about rhetoric in sort of actions or material. So we talk about 9/11. There's a sort of, it is sort of an image event, and it's a kind of material event. And I'm wondering, I know you've written a little bit about the importance of Heidegger and to environmental theory, and there's this move toward, sometimes toward Heidegger, in rhetoric right now, to materialism and ontology. And I wonder how you see yourself in that, if at all, in that movement, that turn that people like Thomas Rickert or several other, Byron Hawke, have sort of turned toward this, especially as someone who's so interested in the environment and humans' interaction with the environment.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really complicated question, Blake. So I'll probably meander around a bit, and I'll probably leave Heidegger to this to the side for the most part. And the reason for that is I'm just I don't know if he gets us where I wanted to go, but what I think Heidegger does that is useful is that he forces us to question our assumptions in various ways, kind of these larger questions. I think maybe Deleuze does that even better if we think about a book, Difference and Repetition, in chapter 3, where he says we have to question the image of thought. And what he means by this, we have to question this idea of the Cartesian subject that thinks about the world that's out there. And I think Deleuze provides us one entry. I would say, to me, this kind of triumvirate of Whitehead, Deleuze, and Latour provide one entry. The other entry would be kind of the object-oriented ontologists that are also kind of trending now, if we have to use kind of a Google word, those two groups. And I think they're very different, and I don't think the object-oriented ontologists are quite right. And I think Whitehead, Deleuze, and Latour are right. And what I mean by that is, for them, all objects are already an assemblage, or are already kind of this agglomeration of things, right? That all objects are not of other things. And I think science kind of proves that for us. So really what Whitehead, Deleuze, and Latour are saying to us is that we're not the Cartesian subject of our dreams. Who wouldn't want to be a Cartesian subject? I wish I was a Cartesian subject. Rational, in control of myself, acting in a world. Fantastic, right? And I have a lot of sympathy for Descartes, because the actual separation of mind and body in his theory ended up his posthumous fate, right? So his body is in a cathedral in Paris, and his head, his skull, is in a museum in Paris. So two different places separated by about 6 miles. So I have a lot of sympathy for poor Descartes' ultimate disrupted disquiet. But in thinking about what comes after the subject, right, Whitehead would say everything is a thing, right? And the subject is just us, kind of us as a result of all these discourses, all these things, all these kind of networks that knot up in us for a moment, right, as the result of an event. Deleuze is a little more comprehensible for us in terms of thinking about assemblages. But if we want to think of ourselves as an assemblage, and Latour uses some of Deleuze's notion of assemblage, even when he's talking about an actor, he's thinking of an assemblage. But science says that to us, right? It's like you and I, we think of ourselves as a subject, but are we really a subject? So science will say 90% of us, 90% of us is made up of other living things, right? Bacteria, viruses, and so on. And we cannot function without them. They're in our eyelids, they're in our eyes, they're in our guts, right? Our whole biome, like all of us are in a biome. If we're a biome, we're fundamentally an assemblage. We're part of the world that we're inhabiting at all moments, right? And environmentally, to me, this becomes very engaging, right? We're never not part of this larger environmental network that we're deeply connected to, that we simply cannot live without. And as Basin would talk about, if we poison our larger network, we're making ourselves insane. That we cannot poison our environment without making ourselves insane. And you could point to all sorts of signs of insanity in the larger environment we live in. I mean, we could talk about kind of the trillion-dollar war machine and all the bombing we do on the planet and so on, but we could just talk about very simple environmental things where we're talking about, for example, the environmental crisis we have as we've gone to getting all of our water from bottles. What the heck is up with that, right? So we literally have a plastic patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas due to all of our plastic waste. Right? It would be perfectly fine for us to drink out of our faucets, right? If it's not, let's fix that problem, as opposed to creating a plastic patch the size of Texas in the Pacific Ocean that all these turtles and fish and stuff are eating, because all the plastic gets degraded into very small pieces of plastic that they then like to eat. So that crazy practice, or crazy practices when I was a kid and you had leaves, if you wanted to move them, you rake them. Now you have this 2-cylinder engine that's spewing exhaust into the environment, as well as making it go deaf. As you blow the leaves, and you don't even get them gone anywhere. They just go from one part of the lawn to the another part, right? So I live on a campus that wants to be a green, sustainable campus as we have leaf blowers all over the place, right? So we have all these practices that make no sense if we're worried about the environment that we're not just living in, but that actually literally constitute us. So this notion of materialism, I think we need to take very literally, right? We're not humans in an environment. We're networks. We're part of networks, right? And those networks are not in an environment that's separate from us. There's no way of making that separation. And if you try to separate us in all sorts of ways, we'd be doomed. Like a lot of people say, the problem with the rise of asthma is that we are living in too antiseptic an environment. Everyone likes cleaning their home, and you don't spend enough time as kids outdoors. Like we should be outdoors accidentally eating things like bugs and dirt and stuff like that. In fact, if you're 2 years old, it's not even an accident. You're trying to eat everything you could get your hands on, right? And what does that do? It builds up a healthy immune system. Without that kind of exposure, we have an unhealthy immune system, right? We've created a network that doesn't work for us. Okay, so I don't want to go too far on that, but the other part with that in terms of materialism is I would insist on an absolute materialism, i.e. words are material also. Right? They're material on a page. They're ink on a page. They're not some idealist thing. We're not in Plato's cave. We hear words. Our eyes process words. All of these are material practices. Marx was very clear on that. So I never really got why Marxists following Marx started to talk about idealism versus materialism. I would say all of these practices, when I speak, there are sound waves that are going through, and then they hit this technology. This technology in front of me I'm banging on, it's completely material. Those earbuds in your ear are completely material. None of this is ideal. It's completely material. So our words, our actions, there's no separation. There's not an ideal world. There's not a material world. It's all materialism, various forms of materialism that are associated and linked and connected and complemented and supplemented in various ways. No divide.
So rhetoric is, we've got this sort of rhetoric as material too, right? It sort of stands next, it's not sort of hypothesized. Is that
right? Absolutely.
That seems very close to you're sort of talking about this through the sort of Latourian lens, as opposed to the sort of object-oriented lens. Do you can you? Well, I don't want us to go too much further, but
I can just say one thing about that.
Yeah, please do. If you can sort of distinguish those, at least for me.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I just don't know where for object-oriented ontology, where there is ever this essence that is not always already part of some relationships, part of some network. Where is this essence? And then show it to me. It seems to me, it reminds me of the movie Time Bandits, where they destroy evil at the end. I don't know if you remember or ever saw that movie. And there's one cinder that's left that they forget to pick up and sweep up. And that's the essence of evil. So we know evil is not going to leave the world because this one essence of evil, this one cinder somehow escaped, right? And so this, and to me, object-oriented ontology then almost is positing, it's very Catholic, positing this soul, right? That somehow in some hidden place in my body, there is this essence, this soul. And that's true for every object. So it's not just my body, it's true for this fossilized clamshell, right? It's true for my pen. There's some essence there, right? And to me, if you think about it long enough and explore it long enough and open that black box, as Latour would talk about it, enough, you're just going to see more relations, that it's relations all the way down. So instead of turtles all the way down, as in Hindu mythology, it's relations all the way down. You just haven't dug long enough, and you stop at a black box and call it the essence of the object. Keep going, and you'll find more relations. Right, this object, this pen, right? Okay, where is the essence? Is the essence this piece of plastic? Is it this red part? The red part kind of stands out. Well, this red part's made out of plastic. Where did this plastic come from? It came from a laboratory. Where did the raw materials come from? Maybe Africa, maybe Asia, maybe the United States, maybe the gigantic mine that's right across the valley from my house. Right, you know, so it's all these relations that produce this red plastic. There's not some mysterious essence here. It's relations and relations, right?
Right, you're talking about this sort of idea of withdrawal that has been
Harmon and others want to talk about, right?
Yep. So let's talk.
And I love Harmon. It's fun to read. Read The Object-Oriented Ontologist. I think it's very productive for environmental thinking, because at the very least, it gets us away from humanism. Right? If there's a bigger problem for thinking about the environment than humanism, the only bigger problem is industrialism. But those two isms are very deadly for thinking about the environment. And object-oriented ontology gets you away from that. So read it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about someone. Let's sort of finish up here. Someone who is trying to think about the environment. Naomi Klein. You said you'd seen her this week. What did you think? What do you think of her sort of attempt? What are its what recommends it, and what sort of do you see as I don't know, give us a little preview of your sort of, I guess, response to Naomi Klein and her This Changes Everything, the new book.
Right. And I have to say, I just got the book about a week ago, so I haven't finished reading it, and I haven't seen the movie. So I've read a couple articles. I've read about parts of the book, and I've seen clips of the movie. So this is not a complete critique. So to be fair, and I would say Naomi Klein's position is great if you want to be optimistic. Right? If you don't want to be pessimistic, if you don't want to take all this news and then be like, oh my God, it's hopeless. Right? Or darn it, it's hopeless. Or frack it, I'm just going to go skiing because there's no point in doing anything else but enjoying the last few years before things really become apocalyptic. So her book is an antidote to that kind of despair, and she's very clear about that, while also being very kind of clear-headed and very well-researched about the real threats facing the planet and the real political obstacles and so on. So she's not simply Pollyannish, right? So I don't want to accuse her of that. What I do want to say, and the thing that's troubled me with the book so far, but I haven't finished it, but I did try to find out if she talks about this anywhere, is that there's a real sense, and this was true of her talk last night, which was quite well done, by the way. She's a good speaker, is that there's a real undergirding of humanism in her thinking. And what I mean by that is humans are still front and center, right? So she'll talk about the destruction happening to other species and stuff, but the biggest issue is still about people. So we had talk last night about the refugee crisis and a living minimum wage, right? And all these issues are fine, but to me, they're not the central issue. That if we don't fix climate chaos, whether or not we have a living minimum wage will be irrelevant, right? If we don't fix climate chaos, these current refugees we have now will be just a trickle compared to the millions and millions of refugees that will be fleeing rising ocean levels and so on. And so to me, if we think of humans too much or first, we're going to end up missing the fact that if humans don't have a sustainable planet, caring about them is not going to matter that much. That caring about humans has to be caring about the planet first and caring about ecosystems first. To give one small example of this, and I know, and to not fault Naomi Klein in particular, environmentalists in general tend to be hesitant to talk about overpopulation. Right? It's just something we just simply tend not to talk about. So Naomi Klein's book is about 450 pages and then over 500 pages with the notes and everything. So a really comprehensive book. Overpopulation doesn't appear in the index. So, and there's no chapter titled Overpopulation. So I can't verify whether or not she talks about overpopulation, but it's not front and center. Yet, in my lifetime, until like a couple months ago, we always talked about the world kind of leveling out about 8 billion people and then starting to go down. Well, a couple months ago, scientists said their best bet now is that we will probably hit almost guaranteed 11 billion people, maybe 12 billion. I have no idea how we have a sustainable planet without mass extinctions and ecosystem failures at 12 billion people. And also massive damage to people and countries and stuff if we're at 12 billion people. So I don't know if this changes everything, how do we not talk about population issues? And then related to that, certainly consumer issues. And certainly Naomi Klein does mention consumer issues, and now we can't consume excessively, but there seems to be an assumption that everyone can live at a pretty good, sustainable life I don't know how that happens with 12 billion people, even with all the green technology in the world.
So yeah,
I
I
didn't
mean,
hear you for a second. Okay.
do you want to add something?
No, I just didn't hear you for a second, but go ahead.
That's okay. Right. So, I mean, I'm going to try to sort of sum us up here a little bit. Right.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about this sort of, I mean, it's sort of the theme here. It's this human subjectivity, right? Which I find that it all kind of comes down to this privileging of the human subject in terms of rationality, in terms of what what counts as a problem, which is interesting to me. Just to sort of it's interesting to me that this kind of thinking should happen under the auspices of rhetoric, which is at least classically
That's a good point.
such a humanist discipline, right? It's suffused with the language of subjectivity and agency, and I know this is another sort of fret in the discipline. I mean, how do you think that rhetoric has can get any purchase here, given all that, or communication, right? The very idea of the very ideas that are sort of baked into rhetoric.
Yes, but there has to be a shift in orientation. And I think that shift is happening partly because the change in our mediascape. If our mediascape changes, our theories and ways of engaging the world have to change. But it's also true for very traditional rhetoricians. If you want to study presidential rhetoric, how can you have a Cartesian subject? Obama's not writing his speeches. Right? There's a speechwriting team. There's 4 or 5 people. He's a good reader of his speeches. But it's not just Obama. Eisenhower wasn't writing his speeches. Reagan wasn't writing his speeches. So it's only a fiction that we have this genius eye, this Abraham Lincoln figure, right, contemporarily writing speeches to persuade other rational people. That's a fiction, even in the most traditional form of rhetoric, presidential rhetoric. We don't have one person out of the genius of their head, like Athena springing forth from Zeus, producing speeches. We have teams of speechwriters, and those speeches are then tested by a whole bunch of consultants and so on. So every presidency, every president is already an assemblage. Obama's an assemblage. The next president will be an assemblage. So in a way, rhetoric can't stay the same. But that's partly what I mean by process. Rhetoric shouldn't be committed to process. It should be committed to an orientation of understanding force in the world. If you're trying to understand force in the world, many different processes can produce force in the world and produce social change in the world. Not just one, not just speeches, right? Not just pamphlets. Instead, speeches, pamphlets, blog sites, Twitter posts, Facebook pages, images, volcanoes, all things produce, or all of these types of modes produce force in the world. And so if we're studying force in the world, we don't have to worry about whether we're wedded to humanism or Marxism or feminism or environmentalism. Instead, we're trying to understand phenomena that change the world. And in that sense, it opens rhetoric up enormously to studying all sorts of things.
That sounds like a great place to end.
Great.
Perfect. Thanks for talking to me, and we're looking forward to having you in February